So we have been in 1 Corinthians for about maybe 4 weeks or so now. And so far, Paul has focused his attention on how the Corinthians, how the congregation had wrongly perceived the leaders of the church. They had esteemed them too highly, and Paul is rebuking them for this. They had an unhealthy adoration for their pastors. And this actually led to their spiritual immaturity. It actually stunted their growth because of how they wrongly perceived him, and in particular Apollos, right, one of his co-laborers. In fact, this was such an issue in the church that Paul dedicates solely the first 4 chapters of this letter just addressing this one issue. And so that's what Paul's been dealing with, and that's what we've been focused on, and what he wanted the Corinthians to know, therefore, that's what he wanted us to know, is that as a leader or as a pastor or as somebody trying to do God's work, he wanted them to know that he was a servant. In particular, he was just a mere instrument of God and should not be perceived as anything more than that. And so that's kind of been the ongoing theme, I think, maybe in every message that we've had, as we work our way through this text. Now, this idea that Paul is a servant, that Apollos and Cephas and those other leaders, Paul's point of saying we're just servants of God, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, that by extension applies to all of us. We're all servants of God. We've all been called into servanthood. It's one of the attributes or the byproduct of what it is to be in Christ. We become his servant. And we talked about that a couple of weeks ago. And so here we arrive in chapter 4, and Paul's going to continue this thought, and he's actually going to drill down a little bit more on what it means to be a servant or what that looks like. So grab your Bibles. Let's read the first 5 verses of chapter 4, and then we'll talk about it. We'll go way through it. He says in verse 1, "This is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. But with me, it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or any other human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself. For I'm not aware of anything against myself, but I am not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, do not pronounce judgment before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then each one will receive his commendation from God." This is a great passage. In light of the fact that he's saying that we are all servants, he's now talking more about where we get our identity, where we get our worth, and how we ought to be judged as servants. And Paul's choice of words in these opening verses are actually quite meaningful. They bring a lot of insight as to how we should regard ourselves and regard those who are serving in our life. So in verse 1, it says, "This is how one should regard us, as servants." Now, the Greek word that Paul uses here for servants, it's different than the one he just used in the previous chapter. In the English translation, it says servants in both, but the Greek word that he uses is different. In English translations of Scripture, the word servant it represents actually a handful of Greek words. And so, although the word servant is an appropriate translation for the Greek words, a little bit of the nuance is lost. And so I want to kind of introduce you to some of the nuance of the words that Paul is actually using here, because it paints a really valuable picture as to what a servant should look like. These Greek words that he chooses to use would have been very familiar to his audience, because remember, it's a Greek church, or it's at least in a Greek city, and it would have been quite impactful to hear his language that he uses. So in the previous chapter, in chapter 3, the word servant is represented by the Greek word diakonos. It's worth making a note of this because it comes together to paint a very sweet picture. Diakonos, this refers to someone who serves or assists other people, in particular in a very humble, lowly manner, or in a very practical way. A diakonos was someone that bussed tables. And so if you look, the etymology of the word suggests that it's the idea of kicking up dust. And so because a busboy is kicking up dust, he's moving around, he's trying to serve tables. So you get a real picture of what it is just to be serving in maybe one of the most lowly positions. And that's how he refers to himself. We actually get the word deacon from the word diakonos, which gives us a bit of a sense as to what a deacon's ministry should look like. And so Paul describes him and Apollos as spiritual leaders of this church. He says that they are servants using the word diakonos, using the plural, in that case for him and Apollos. And so that's what the word that we used in the previous chapter. Now here in chapter 4, in verse 1 with what we just read, when it says, this is how one should regard us as servants of Christ, the Greek word he uses here is huperetes. And usually we don't really get into talking about the Greek words in the original language because usually it's a little bit unnecessary, but this is fascinating, and I think it's worth you pondering Paul's choice of words. So huperetes, this gives a really good, vivid image as to what a servant should look like. So huper, it's the first part of the word, that's the preposition meaning under, and redes is connected with being a rower. So it's an under rower. The term under rower, it refers to the people that toil on the lower deck of a ship. They are in the lower level gallery. They were lower level gallery slaves on a ship. They were the huperetes. And I was doing a little bit of reading about Athenian navy and in Roman ships and just getting a little bit of an insight as to how they operated. And it was like a 3-level ship. I think we have an image here. There's a lower deck. You got these different stacks of oars, and this is referring to the people that were right down the bottom rowing. And they had to be in sync with the other rowers that were above them. And Paul is using this language to describe what him and Apollos are doing. He's saying, look, as a servant of God, we're like a huperetes. We're like slaves at the bottom of the ship, the most lowliest position. So when he used this word, the audience would have heard that. And it would have been some very strong imagery for them. And to give you an idea of what life was like for someone who is rowing at the bottom of a ship in that lowly position, it was said that the crew or the other guests upon this vessel, they would actually empty out the sewage down into the lower deck. That's how unglamorous it was. That's how bottom of the barrel it was to serve at that capacity. That's what Paul calls himself. He goes, I'm just a huperetes. We're just a diakonos. He's using some really meaningful words. Now, why is he doing that? Well, not only because it's true, when you're a servant of God, it's a very lowly, humble position, but he has to emphasize this with this church because they just have esteemed them so highly. This church were walking around saying, oh, Apollos, oh, he's the best. Oh, Paul, no, he's where it's at. Oh, I like Peter. He's the top dog. They were putting them up on a pedestal, and this is why Paul is rebuking him. And so not only does he take himself off the pedestal, he takes him down to one of the lowest kind of levels in the ranking of society that he could. And so we start getting a sense of this modest, lowly attitude of what it is to be a servant of God. The exact opposite of how the Corinthians were perceiving him. And so in the first example, in chapter 3, he calls himself a diakonos, which is a humble servant. And now he downgrades that even further in this next chapter here, calling himself a huperetes. Another word that Paul uses that we see in this opening verse here is he says in verse 1, when he says, this is how one should regard us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. The word stewards there is oikonomos. Another significant word. In fact, Paul uses this to refer to himself on a few other occasions. And the oikonomos is the assigned servant or the assigned slave in a home that oversees things for the master. So the master would appoint one of his slaves and say, okay, I want you to kind of oversee the affairs of the home. I'm going to be leaving town for a while. I want you to oversee things. I want you to take care of my home. I want you to make sure that people are taken care of and bills are paid and the affairs of the home are handled. That's an oikonomos. That's being a good steward or a good manager. Now, the picture we should have in our mind here is Paul is saying, I'm just an oikonomos. I'm just a servant. I'm just a slave who takes care of the master's house. I want to fulfill all the things he wants me to fulfill. I'm not in a prominent position. I'm not in this big authority position. I'm just a humble servant. I just want to be a good steward serving the Lord. And that gives us a really good picture of what our servanthood should look like, that we should just be taking care of the household of God. We should be taking care of the affairs of the master while he's away, waiting for his return. The imagery is strong. So he is a diakonos. He is a huperetes. He is an oikonomos. And the fourth one here I want to draw your attention to. This is a label that Paul proudly wears. And a few other of his epistles, in particular Philippians, Romans, and Titus, he refers to himself as a doulos. You may have heard this word before, a doulos. This is the most common label or Greek word that Paul uses to describe himself. Doulos means slave. Paul considers himself a slave. I mean, as we go through these words, they're getting kind of more and more low, kind of in the social ranking. They're becoming increasingly selfless the more you go down. Doulos is a fascinating word for him to call himself a slave. Now, again, in the English Bible, typically the word doulos is just transliterated into either servant or bondservant. I want you to make a note of this. When you're reading through Scripture and you see that someone is a bondservant, you could jump online and have a quick look because the word is probably actually slave. I'm fine with the English translators calling it servant. I think that's fine. But it does miss a little bit of, because a servant feels a little bit more prestigious than a slave, right? And Paul is saying, oh, I'm a slave. I'm a slave of Christ. And actually this whole concept of spiritual slavery is actually fascinating, and we won't get into it, but just to make the point that Paul recognizes that, I'm not a slave to sin. I've been set free. I'm a slave to Christ. And this speaks to this idea of being purchased by Christ. He's purchased us with his blood. That's what the word redemption means. So this whole doctrine of atonement and redemption, it's speaking to this idea of being purchased out of slavery, no longer a slave over there, we're now a slave to Christ. I mean, that would be great to talk further on, which we won't today. So Paul refers to himself in his ministry as a servant. That's the image. That's how he sees himself. Well, you and I are servants. You and I have been called to serve. That's what we spoke about a couple of weeks ago. And now we're getting a little picture as to what that should look like, what the posture of the heart should look like. So this leads to our first point this morning. True servanthood is characterized by lowliness and humility. These words Paul uses portray a very valuable picture of what it's like to be God's servant. No glitz, no glamour, no prestige in doing God's work. There's no self-gain. There's no self-promotion. In fact, Paul is going out of his way to reduce or demote himself in the eyes of people that he's serving. And ironically, you could say that Paul was actually the highest ranking Christian among his peers. And he's reducing himself to be the least among them, because that's how he understood himself as a servant of God. And again, please don't make the mistake of thinking I'm talking about pastors or spiritual leaders or those in ministry. This is for all of us. We're all servants of God. So when we see ourselves as a lowly, humble servant, just laboring for the Lord, our expectations, our demeanor, and our attitude changes. You have a real different mindset. If you understand that as a servant of God, that's what your heart and your attitude is meant to look like, that changes everything, because now you'll step into serving and being used by the Lord and being one who plants or one who waters seeds, one of those people that are doing God's work. You'll have a very different attitude if you see yourself in the same way that Paul saw himself. You don't have that sense of entitlement anymore. Your pride will diminish. And it's really important for us to have the right heart and right attitude as we are serving, which we'll get into more here in a moment. Consider what it was like to be an under-rower. I mean, other than sewage being poured upon you, that's not ideal, right? That gives you a real sense of like, oh man, I'm laboring in the worst conditions. The under-rower, they don't have any say on where the ship goes. They just, wherever the captain chooses, that's where they're going. They have to be in sync with the other rowers who are at different levels. There's no appreciation. There's no thanks. Do you think the captain's sending a little text message down to the crew saying, hey, you guys are doing real good down there. Keep going. I bet you the captain doesn't even know who they are. They're completely anonymous, unknown people just laboring and getting the ship where it needs to go. And without them, the ship actually wouldn't go anywhere. A thankless job. That's what it is to serve the Lord. So Paul's self-description as a humble servant, it's a powerful reminder for us that as we are the hands and feet of Christ, as we are planting, as we're watering seeds, as we're trying to be a blessing to people, we should do so with absolute humility and selflessness. In John 13, Jesus exemplifies this, where get a real picture of his leadership here. He washes the feet of the disciples. What? Don't you think that they should have washed his feet? In fact, that's what one of them said. I mean, this is the same man where when John the Baptist saw Jesus, he said, that man, I'm not even worthy to untie his sandal. And here Jesus is, in the height of his ministry, washing the feet of the disciples. No glitz, no glamour, no prestige. This leads to the second point this morning. And it's Paul's main point, by the way, in these opening couple of verses, is that, a servant's approval, it comes from their master. It doesn't come from the people that they're serving. Let's read that in verse 3. I want you to look at it in your own Bibles here. It says, but with me, it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you. Paul's uninterested and unimpressed that they all valued him quite highly. He's like, that's a pretty small thing for me. By you or a human court, I'm not interested. In fact, I don't even judge myself. For I am not aware of anything against myself, but I am not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord. He's the one that judges me. That's important. That's why with utmost confidence and peace of heart and peace of mind, Paul can serve in the most lowly of positions with absolute just kind of humility, thankless position, because he knows, well, at the end of the day, I ain't doing it for you. I'm not really doing it for your approval. And so that's what he's saying here, is he's telling the church, your approval or disapproval is meaningless to me. I don't value it. Yes, you all took a vote and you all said that me and Apollos were doing really good. And we got some pretty good Yelp reviews from you all. But he rebuked them for this because the church are ascribing value and worth to man when it should be going to God. And so that's why he's unimpressed, because he's thinking, oh, you guys are speaking very well of us, and you're talking about how, oh, Apollos, he's amazing, oh, Paul. And remember, he mentioned this back in chapter 2. He said, we don't have any impact on spiritual transformation. That's something the Holy Spirit does. Why on earth would you be, giving us an attaboy? All glory should go to God. Yeah, are we planting and watering and serving? Sure. But that is a lowly job. That's why he says in verse 3, it's a very small thing that I should be judged by you. He doesn't regard their approval. And I actually think that's quite liberating. If you are a servant, if you're a person, and when I say a servant, we're all servants because we're all trying to serve others. We're trying to be a blessing to other people. It's actually quite freeing and liberating to not need their approval. Because if you need their approval, then your acts of service rise and fall based on whether you're being encouraged or discouraged. You can't be tethered to the approval of man. Paul was not impressed that he was one of their favorites. I think this is true, and I think you would agree that, yearning for the acceptance of man, it's really exhausting. And he even says, I don't even judge myself. Because we can be so brutal on ourselves, we can be so critical. I know what it's like. I know it's like to, kind of go back to my office and think, oh man, I did bad. I didn't do a good job. I didn't have the impact I thought I should have. What? So, I shouldn't even be judging myself on this because God is ultimately doing work here. What on earth makes me think that I should be doing a post-mortem on my own work here? And so Paul is basically saying, I don't really care what you think. I don't really care about your approval. And even my own assessment is not meaningful to me. And so if God is the perfect and sole judge of our servanthood and all we do, then we want to live by his standards in order to live for his approval. And I have to say this, living to please God and not man, to be honest, if we're all honest with each other here, which we might as well be, it's difficult. The flesh, there's a part of us that battles that. I mean, most of us struggle with that at times where we have this innate kind of desire to people please or to want people to approve of us. Oh, it's a horrible trap. I'm reminded of an interview I saw with the musician John Mayer. I think most of you would be familiar with this guy. In this interview I watched, he talked about how he was an ego addict, which is some pretty good self-awareness to recognize about himself. And he openly discusses this deep, innate desire he has for accolades and for attention. He recognized that about himself. And he even recalls in this interview going home from the Grammys as a Grammy award-winning musician, sitting in his limousine, still checking his social media to see if people approved of him. And he thought, what am I doing? I'm sitting here holding Grammy awards and I'm still going to Twitter to try and get a sense of worth and life? And to his credit, that's a really important thing to recognize, that you are enslaved to the approval of man. The problem with seeking peer approval is when we do that, our metric, we're using a grade scale that's meaningless, because none of us are valid judges. It doesn't really matter kind of how we weigh in on things. And so as believers and as servants of God. We need to divorce ourselves from the approval of others, the approval of the world. The scripture, it's actually a pretty overarching theme, actually, in scripture, is that we're not meant to live for the world, we're meant to live for God. It says in Matthew 6, probably the most salient text on this, is no one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the other and despise the other. Basically saying, yeah, if you're going to live with that thing as being your target of service and you're trying to serve that, then you are not serving God. It's one or the other. And again, we're seeing this picture here in this text. Seldom can we serve God and man simultaneously. I think this is a good reminder for us because we actually will find a sense of life, a sense of self-worth. We will be validated. We'll find our motivation in serving God, not serving man. And that needs to be sufficient for us. If you want to be a servant and you want to be faithful to do the things that God's called you to do and be a blessing to people, it needs to be enough that God sees it and that God's judging it and that he's blessed by it. That has to be the reason why you do it. And that's what Paul's saying. He's like, man, I don't care what you guys think. You guys had a congregational meeting to talk about whether I was awesome? I don't care. I don't even decide if I'm awesome because God is my sole judge. That's his point here. So we should find peace in not needing to perform for those around us. Because, and this is true, this is something I have to think about. If my sense of confidence or self-worth or how I feel like I'm doing, if it's going to be based upon whether I think you guys are signing off on it, it's not like at the Olympics where you guys are going to hold up a score and I'm going to look at it and go, yes. Okay, I'll be back next week. This went well. I cannot get life from you guys. People are a fickle audience, aren't they? You guys are the worst, right? You know that. I've told you that. But if we do that, we're just going to have a really short shelf life in serving God and trying to be a blessing to people. God is going to perfectly measure and weigh all we do. Only God's going to know how genuine you were with it. Only God's going to know your sincerity. Only God's going to know your motive. Only God's going to see the hidden things that you did. Only God's going to know the prayer and the emotion and the passion that went into being a servant. People are not going to see all that. Only God's going to see the sacrifice that you went through, the discouragement that you faced as you tried to be a good servant for him and tried to be a blessing to people. Only God's going to see the challenges that you had in trying to do God's work and be a blessing to the people around you. God sees it all, and he will perfectly judge it. Let me share a few verses with you on this point here in Galatians. You don't need to turn there. I just want you to know about it. In chapter 1, Paul says, For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I was still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. So again, this is Paul speaking. He's talking to the church in Galatia here, and he's going as far to say that if he was a person who was trying to serve the approval of man, he wouldn't be a servant. Well, he would just be a servant of man, not a servant of God. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 23, he says, Whatever you do, work heartedly as for the Lord and not for men. So whatever it is you do, whatever task, thought, speech, action, whatever these things you do it wholeheartedly for God, not for man. And so Paul reminds the church in Colossae about that. In fact, nearly all of Paul's letters, he brings this topic up. And so that temptation that we have, and it is a temptation, we do struggle with it, to find worth and approval from others, can leave us often feeling really discouraged and feeling just unappreciated. Sometimes we can find ourselves in a relationship or in a ministry or in some kind of an arrangement where we're coming into it to want to be a blessing and to want to serve, and it can just feel, it can be really disheartening. It can be seemingly very unrewarding. It can seem like, man, here I am trying to be a blessing to you and you're treating me awful. That's a thing. And if you've forgotten that, well, it doesn't matter how you're treating me because I'm not doing it. I'm doing it to be a blessing to you, but I'm actually a servant of God. And God has asked me to do this. So I'm doing it for him. So I'm doing it for his approval. I'm doing it for his judgment. So it really doesn't matter kind of how you're interacting with me here. But we can feel unappreciated. It's always a bummer when you're being a servant in a very fatiguing context where your tank is not being filled. It can feel very unrewarding. And that's why Paul's making this point, is we have to get our sustenance, we have to get our motivation, and we have to be driven by the fact that we are serving the Lord. Because otherwise, as a servant, you will be very up and down, and you'll be a very kind of emotional with the whole thing. Imagine if Paul walked into the foyer at church in Corinth, and he could hear everybody talking about, oh, guys, it's going to be a good morning. Paul's not preaching, Apollos is preaching. That guy's good. He's very good. But do you guys even know what Paul talked about last week? Yeah, me neither. It was lame. But I tell you what, Apollos, he's good, right? Imagine if Paul heard that and then went, oh, man, and just kind of left, feeling discouraged, disheartened. I'm just trying to be a blessing to these guys, and they're kind of running their mouth about me, and they think Apollos is so much better. If Paul had any regard for how man felt about what God's called him to do, there would be no book of 2 Corinthians, right? He would say, fine, you're on your own. They love me in Ephesus, I'm heading up there. Right, so it's so important that Paul and Apollos did not get their sense of self-worth from the congregation. And so when you ponder all the different contexts that we've been called to serve, it is like in your marriage, you have to serve your spouse, be a servant to your husband, a servant to your wife. And what if you're doing that and the level of service that you offer to your spouse is based on whether they appreciate you or not? Well, then you're going to withhold your service because you didn't really fill my tank. I don't really feel like you appreciate how much of a great servant I am to you. So both of you are then just going to be going up and down and being just not selfless. Now, if you served your spouse because you're not doing it for their approval and you're not doing it because they deserve it, you're doing it because God has called you to do it and you're doing it to honor and please him, well, now you're in even keel. Now your servanthood doesn't go up or down based on how someone else values and appreciates you. Maybe it's the same with your boss. Maybe it's the same with a colleague. Maybe you've been serving here in this church for 5 years and nobody knows your name and they don't even appreciate what you do. Maybe, I'm sorry if that's the case, that's not our desire, but at the end of the day, the Lord knows, the Lord sees, and that has to be enough. And that's why in verse 5, you'll see that Paul says, when it's all said and done, then each one will receive his commendation from God. At the end of the day, God's going to judge and reward. And we're going to find some peace in that. In Hebrews 6, for God is not unjust as to overlook your work and the love that you have shown for his name in serving the saints in all you do. That's a good verse. Now, I should clarify, yes, we don't care. We don't care what people think. And yes, we're not doing it for them. We're doing it for the Lord. And the way we do it for the Lord is by being selfless and loving for them. Yes, that's true. Now, that does not make you impervious from people maybe criticizing, critiquing, something you're doing. Like somebody can still come up to you and say, oh, hey, when you did this thing, just so you know, this was a little bit off, or you may have hurt somebody while doing that. You can't say, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. I don't work for you, work for God. right? Tell him to tell me. Get out of here. You don't. This does not preclude us from being, from people having influence to shape, obviously, our servanthood. And so I should make that point. And that leads to kind of my final point this morning. And it's going to feel like a contradictory point to everything we've spoken about, but it's not. And that is this: we need to encourage those in our lives who are a spiritual blessing, who do serve us, who do pour into us. We've got to encourage and be so thankful and show appreciation for the people that God has appointed and placed in your life. And he has, by the way. God has hand-selected 1 to 100 people, put them in your life to minister to you, to be a servant to you, to build you up, to lift you up. And we should encourage those people who are in our life. Now, yes, Paul is rebuking them for their high praise and their excessive reliance and their weird admiration of him. But that does not, and that's true. Yes, Paul is saying, don't do that. But that does not mean that we don't have a responsibility to encourage and appreciate people. Of course. We should express gratitude and appreciation. People need to be encouraged. By God's grace, he has put people in your life, and it is a thoughtful and kind thing every now and just to show some respect and kindness and encouragement to those people. Now, servants, those who do serve, they shouldn't depend on that. That shouldn't give them life. That shouldn't be the reason, or they shouldn't await that, so then they will continue to be a servant. Again, God is our judge, and he is our motivation, and he is our fullness of why we do these things. But being appreciated and encouraged is valuable. Encouragement, it's a powerful tool. And it really does. It's a burst of energy to people to encourage them. Stay in it. Keep doing what you're doing. That's what Paul again said to the Galatians. He said towards the end of the letter, he says in chapter 6, and he encourages them, hey guys, don't grow weary in doing good. Don't give up. Keep going. This is good. Yeah, you're doing it for the Lord. Maybe you're not doing it in order for me to say this to you, church, but Paul's saying, don't grow weary in it. Keep at it. This is good. And in due season, you will reap. In time, maybe it'll feel a little bit more rewarding. And he's telling us not to give up. And so Paul goes out of his way to encourage them, the church. And so at times we need to be encouraged. Encouragement is very encouraging, isn't it? You want to write that down? That was good. That was solid. In a similar manner, Paul talks to the church in Thessalonica, says something similar. He's talking kind of just about appreciating leaders. He says, we ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you and who are over you and who admonish you, to esteem them highly in love. Again, he's just making the point, hey, God's saying, I put people in your life. They're a blessing. Value them, appreciate them, respect them. This is good. And so he does that again in 1 Timothy, just reminding the church, hey, value and respect the people that I've put in your life to be a blessing. Encouraging one another to be faithful and continuing to plant, continuing to water seeds, to continue to be an instrument of God. This is a good thing, and it's not in contradiction to everything I've said up until this point of don't do it for them, do it for God. Yeah, do that for God. But at the same time, as instruments, as ministers, as people that want to be faithful to God in our servanthood, we need to be encouraged. And we need to, sometimes it does feel good to just be appreciated and valued. And so we should take that time to make sure that we are faithful to encourage one another. Because it does, it strengthens and uplifts us. And it reminds us, yeah, like if somebody came to you and said, hey, I noticed you're a greeter this morning. I just want you to know, I always love it when I see you greeting. You smile, you make eye contact with me. I feel like I matter. I appreciate you doing that. For you as the greeter, you were doing this for God, right? You were doing this just to to be a blessing to the church. But that's so encouraging. And that causes you to be like, oh my goodness, thank you. Next week, you're going to even more so just want to be a blessing, right? So this is a good thing to encourage the people around us. Now, obviously, I have to say, don't flatter them. Don't just simply praise them for their actions. I'm more appealing to you to, hey, express your appreciation to those that God has placed in your life. I would even say take some time even this week to reach out to someone who has been a blessing to you. Maybe it's like this old youth pastor from 20 years ago who has no idea the impact that they had on your life. Do you know how meaningful it would be for you to track them down and say, hey, God used you. I know that maybe you didn't feel it, but God, you were watering and you were planting and you were so consistent in it, and it made all the difference. God used you. And I'm so thankful that you were faithful. I'm so thankful that you didn't give up. If maybe there's a boss or a colleague, there's someone in your life that God has placed to be your servant, I think encouraging them in that is a good thing. I'm going to invite the worship team up here just as I make a couple of closing comments. Yeah, instruments of God, we all need to be encouraged. So church, my hope this morning, 3 things that I hope that you feel encouraged in this morning. And the first is this: being a servant, which we are called to do, is a humble and lowly call. It's a privilege. It's a very sweet thing. Secondly, God alone measures and weighs that. God sees all. And therefore, his approval and his eyes upon your service, on your servanthood, needs to be sufficient. It needs to be enough for you. Thirdly, we should recognize the people that God has, the wonderful people that God has put in our lives, the people that God has put in to build us up, to strengthen us, for us to bear with one another in what we go through, to be a prayer warrior in your life, to say the right verse in the right time. Someone's been your cheerleader. Someone's been encouraging you. Yeah, keep going. You got it. God put those people in your life. And you are that to someone else. So while it often feels a little bit exhausting to go unappreciated or unnoticed, don't give up and remember you're doing it unto the Lord. And when it's all said and done, when you stand before God, he's going to be the final judge on this, and he's going to perfectly reward all that you did. Those hidden thoughts in your heart, the hurts that you even felt, the discouragement that you even felt trying to do the Lord's work. God sees it, and he's going to honor and bless and reward that. So stay the course, church, as servants of God. And as we're faithful in that, I believe we can truly make a tremendous impact, not only in one another's lives, but in our community, in our culture, and in this world. All right, let's pray. God, again, I love how you speak to us, calling us to be servants, calling us to be busy about our Father's business. And God, I pray that there might be some people here this morning that are thinking, man, I want to do more. I want to be put me in, coach, use me. I want to serve more people. I want to do more. God, I pray that you would open doors. I pray that you would call us into a deeper desire for servanthood, because, God, we all want to plant more seeds and water. We all want to see growth, and that is something that you do. And God, it's a humbling thing for us to be part of your divine work here on earth. So God, use us, and may we be empty vessels. May we be vessels fit for the Master's use. And so God, thank you for calling us and for equipping us and empowering us and endowing us with the ability to do your work. We just want to pray for this and just give thanks for that. And even just worship you now from that place. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, my friends, let's stand as we close in a song.